Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the United Nations opening of the 16th Annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. My name is Hillel Neuer, and I am the Executive Director of United Nations Watch, one of 25 human rights NGOs that is organizing and sponsoring the 2024 Geneva Summit. Please note that this event is being recorded. Next month, in this Palais des Nations, the United Nations will open the 56th session of the Human Rights Council. We are here today to urge the world's highest human rights body to address some of the most urgent situations where individual freedoms are under threat, and to bear witness, to sound the alarm, to call for action. Courageous human rights voices from the four corners of the earth have gathered here today at the United Nations, activists and former political prisoners, journalists, from the depths of Asia to the heart of Latin America, from the former Soviet Union to the stretches of Africa, to bear witness before the world of their struggle against tyranny. Despite differences in language, religion, and culture, we are united today in our commitment to oppose dictatorships and oppression, to uphold the fundamental principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary we just marked here in December. Now, today, more than ever, our resolve is tested by the audacity of oppression that shadows our world. In China, the relentless grip of authoritarianism tightens as the regime implements the social credit system to enforce absolute compliance through surveillance and social control. And today, in a moment, we'll hear from representatives of ethnic minority groups who are being crushed. We'll hear from Abdoueli Ayoub, a linguist poet who's been a vocal advocate for the Uyghur language and culture. He endured imprisonment and yet continues his activism against the destruction of his people and culture. We'll hear from Chimi Lamo, a steadfast community organizer who challenges the systematic suppression faced by Tibetans, advocating for their rights and autonomy despite severe personal risks. And tomorrow we'll hear from Ray Chia, a former political prisoner whose only crime was protesting with a blank white piece of paper in her hands, her only crime. The people of Russia and their neighbors are all victims of the regime of Vladimir Putin. From Siberia, we'll hear from journalist Alexandra Garmazhapova, founder of the Free Buryatia Foundation. She exposes the harsh reality of ethnic discrimination, military conscription that fuels Moscow's war efforts against Ukraine. Despite being sentenced in absentia to years in prison for her outspoken stance, she continues her truth-telling work from afar, a beacon of resistance against a regime that criminalizes dissent. Now, speaking of Siberia, I do need to mention our close friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza. He was arrested 2 years ago after he went on CNN in Moscow to protest Vladimir Putin and the war against Ukraine. Moments later, they took him away. He hasn't been seen since. He was sentenced last year to 25 years in prison for treason. For treason, he was sent to a Siberian penal colony where he is suffering today. His health is in danger. He's been at our summit repeatedly. Last year we had his wife, Evgenia, to speak for his release. And we are thinking of Vladimir. Tomorrow there will be an empty chair on the stage dedicated to his freedom. We urge the United States, the European Union, and all countries that have the power to do whatever they can to free Vladimir Kara-Murza. Now, Russia's Putin doesn't only threaten the people of Russia, but of course the entire region. His brutal war seeks not only to wipe a free and independent Ukraine off the map, but it is also a war on the entire international rules-based system. Ukraine stands resilient under the shadow of Russian aggression. We're honored to have with us, she'll be speaking soon, is Lisa Yasko, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, to tell us about her struggle to keep the international community engaged and committed to the right to life of the Ukrainian people, despite the ongoing conflict that ravages her nation. In Belarus, the iron fist of Lukashenko's regime tries to silence voices like Veronika Tsepkalo, who fled her homeland after daring to challenge the fraudulent elections that keep a dictator in power. From exile, she leads the Belarus Women's Foundation, championing the democratic aspirations of her people. We'll hear from her in a moment. From Zimbabwe, we will hear from Job Sikala, who exemplifies the courage to defy a regime that incarcerates those who dare to dream of democracy. After spending nearly 2 years in pretrial detention, they tried to silence his voice so he couldn't challenge the elections. He remains a stalwart figure in the opposition movement, undeterred by the threats against him. Now, at the very moment that we meet here, in a nearby chamber, the Islamic Republic of Iran is holding a gavel as president of the Conference on Disarmament in this building right now. Does a regime that foments war and terrorism throughout the region and in many other parts of the world, including by arming Russia — we can ask our friends from Ukraine who are suffering missiles sent by Iran to Russia to bomb the Ukrainian people — does this regime have the legitimacy to chair the world's top forum of disarmament? It was also elected, here it's by rotation, but in New York they were elected a rapporteur of the UNGA Committee on Disarmament. Now, Iran is a regime that not only suppresses free speech, but imposes severe punishments, including death, who dare to defy its theocratic rule. The death sentence just the other week was issued against the rapper Tumaj. And with us here, we have a former political prisoner, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, who's come all the way from Australia. She spent over 2 years in the notorious Evan prison on baseless charges, and she'll speak out against the practice of using foreign nationals as pawns in geopolitical games. We also have with us from Iran, tomorrow is going to receive our Courage Award. We have 2 representatives from Iran International. We're going to hear from Ali Asghar Ramazanpour. He's the editor-in-chief, the head of news of Iran International. He's someone who was convicted in absentia by the regime in order to silence him. His organization is repeatedly targeted in so many ways because they reach 20 million followers around the world exposing the regime. And of course, we're going to hear from Pouria Zerati, the journalist from Iran International, news presenter, host of the Last Word program. He was brutally stabbed just recently in London, and yet he's managed to be with us, surviving this brutal attack. And we're going to hear from him about why Iran International is trying to be silenced, what they're trying to report to the world. In North Korea, the regime's disregard for human life is evident in its treatment of the disabled, the vast network of prison camps where untold atrocities occur. We'll hear from Hyosim Mang, a defector. She'll bring light to the dire situation in her country, particularly the plight of disabled individuals, often the most marginalized. From the oppressive landscape of Vietnam, where the crackdown on free speech and activism results in harsh sentences and human rights abuses, we will hear from Chun Tin Nguyen, who for his pro-democracy efforts was made to suffer behind bars as a prisoner of conscience for more than 4 years. In Cuba, the regime's crackdown on the San Isidro movement, a collective of artists and intellectuals who demanded free speech, illustrates the regime's intolerance for dissent. Cuba is a member of the UN Human Rights Council, but has never been held to account. No resolutions, no special sessions, no inquiries. We'll hear from Carolina Barrero, who was arrested, detained, and forced into exile for her participation in peaceful protests and remains a vocal critic of Havana's repressive tactics. In Venezuela, the Maduro regime has caused more than 7 million people to flee. We're going to hear soon from Victor Navarro, a journalist who spoke out for democracy and freedom for the most vulnerable groups of Venezuelan society. As a result of calling out the Maduro regime, he was arbitrarily detained in 2018 at the age of 22. He underwent physical and psychological abuse and torture while being held in El Helicodi, Venezuela's clandestine torture facility. From Bolivia, we will hear from Toribia Lero Quispe, an indigenous leader, activist from the Sura Nation. She's a member of the Bolivian legislature, a leader of the democratic opposition, where she's known for her defense of human rights. In 2019, independent election observers uncovered fraud committed by the regime of Evo Morales, and Lero Quispe was one of the politicians whose election had been tampered with. For her work opposing Morales' authoritarianism, she and her fellow Bolivian Democrats routinely face intimidation and widespread persecution. Finally, in Nicaragua, not long ago, the dictator Daniel Ortega put all of his opponents in prison. And we're going to hear from Lester Aleman, a student leader and political activist. In 2018, he famously stood up to Ortega, demanded that the dictator step down. As a result, he had to flee the country while police were searching for him. He returned a year later. He was one of dozens of opposition figures arrested in 2021 during the run-up to the elections. He was charged with conspiracy to undermine national integrity, sentenced to 13 years in prison. He managed eventually to get out. He was one of more than 200 political dissidents expelled from Nicaragua last year. And of course, last year we had Felix Maradiaga, who was also released, and he spoke at our event. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to listen to stories of these remarkable individuals, let us draw inspiration from their unyielding courage and unwavering commitment to justice and human rights. And I do also mention, of course, we're going to hear from, I didn't mention, Fatou Balde, who is one of the leading figures in the Gambia, is a women's rights activist fighting to end female genital mutilation, has received many awards for her struggle. It's a country where they're threatening to undo the ban on female genital mutilation. It's already been passed in the first and second reading in Parliament, and we're going to hear from Fatou very soon. Now, this summit is not only a platform for these brave souls to share their struggles, but it gives each of us the opportunity to amplify their voices on a global stage here at the United Nations where collective action can be mobilized.